basically, I started in undergrad in Western New York at the University of Rochester, and it's a really research-intensive undergrad school, so I was involved in research projects from my freshman year all the way through. It's the type of place that they involve undergrads a lot in their work, and undergrads tend to go on to grad school there in clinical psychology and experimental psychology. So when I was there, I wasn't doing a whole lot of like forensic neuropsychology necessarily, but I studied psychology and specifically human motivation, and I did kind of a senior thesis on antisocial motivation because I wanted to do forensic work. And I also minored in brain and cognitive science. So like from the beginning, I was kind of doing both of the things that I thought were interesting. I did not know about the field of forensic psychology. I did not know about the field of neuropsychology. I was young and just kind of doing things that I thought were interesting. So at the end of my undergrad, I had to start looking at programs, and I applied for doctoral programs, and I didn't get into any of them. But one of them was nice enough to offer me a slot in the master's program, which I took, and I ended up going to Drexel University for my master's in psychology. And the reason I chose that was Drexel has very developed focus on forensic psychology and neuropsychology. They have faculty who do that, research in those two areas, and it's one department that houses both of them. So they were able, I thought, they would be able to show me more about what the professional practice of these things are, give me the skills I needed to get into that. So I went there for a very specific reason. I also thought Philadelphia seemed like a cool place to live, and I'm from the Northeast, so I was going to be somewhat close to home. So I went there, and for my thesis, I took classes and did stuff in forensic psychology and neuropsychology. And I did a thesis where I surveyed neuropsychologists about their forensic experience and training and how often they were going up on the stand and being questioned and that sort of thing. So it was a really practical sort of thesis that I did. And I liked it so much that I applied to stay, and I did well enough that they accepted me to stay. So I ended up going to Drexel for my PhD as well. And that allowed me to, with the foundation I have, really focus on like an applied project in forensic and neuropsychology. So what I did for my dissertation was neuropsychological evaluations with 100 incarcerated individuals, like a 3-hour battery of tests in a prison setting where eventually I also wrote 13 grants, 2 of which got funded, and I was able to fund 5 research assistants. And the 6 of us together, working in a prison, got 3-hour batteries done on 100 people. So I do not recommend doing something like this for your projects. It was a ton of work, and if I hadn't gotten the grants when I did, I probably would have ended up with like 15 people in my dissertation sample, which is enough for a dissertation, like not much else. You're not gonna really get published, present on that kind of thing. So that's what my dissertation was on. But in graduate school, you do a whole lot of different things. So I was taking classes in all of the clinical psych things, focusing on forensic assessment and neuropsychological assessment. I also worked with policymakers on diversion and reentry programming, which is people with severe mental illness are involved in the criminal justice system at disproportionate rates. And people with severe mental illness have a hard time getting out of the criminal justice system, staying out of the criminal justice system, and there's a lot of effort on diverting people with severe mental illness away from the justice system and into like psychiatric care, which is what they need. And when they are involved in the justice system, to make sure that there's re-entry programming that can help them stay successful out in the community. So the other reason I'm bringing that up is because I had no idea that this sort of thing happened that there were policymakers that were specifically interested in this, and it was a really strong part of my doctoral training that really broadened my idea of like what psychologists can do and where they can be involved. And it's also in line with forensic psychology. So, more to your question, so as part of doctoral training, you do clinical externships or practica, and typically after your first year, you do these year-long trainings, and there's a whole application process for them. You have to interview and be accepted. I'm sure you're going through that process.
First year, I just started.
Okay, all right, well then you will be relatively shortly. And you have to design them in a way, almost as if the same way you pick classes and pick who you're going to work with for research, you have to pick your clinical training experiences to support your growth also. So your question was, how do you balance it? You basically apply for all of them and hope you get enough of each. So you don't want to just be one. Like you don't just want to do forensic practicum. You just want to do neuro. You want to do both, and you want to do something else. Like you want to have a broad base of clinical training. Because to be a forensic psychologist, you need to be a good psychologist first. And to be a good neuropsychologist, you need to be a good psychologist first. And you don't have the same exposure to patients and training models and supervisors out. It's important to expose yourself to as many models of training, as many supervisors as possible, because forensic psychologists know one thing, neuropsychologists know one thing. You're going to need to know a lot of things. I pull on experiences I got not doing forensic or neuro work all the time. So I'm really happy I'm doing. And when I say other stuff, I worked at a psychiatric hospital, and I worked at a rehabilitation hospital. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just wondering because I was told that in order to be competitive for a neuropsych internship, 3 years of externship should all be neuropsych, and I'm wondering like how forensic, or I guess any other like experience would play into that.
Yeah, so let me continue. I think it's going to answer your question. Yeah. So here I am in my graduate program, doing the best that I can to focus on forensic psychology, neuropsychology, doing all the training that I think makes sense. And throughout all this, I realized that you can always do forensic work. Like forensic is an open field. Forensic just means whatever you're doing, just aim it towards answering legal questions, or helping the legal system, or working in social justice. That's what makes it forensic. The field of forensic psychology is not closed off to you if you don't do like the externships and the early experiences, right? So I encourage you all, if you want to do forensic work, a really smart thing to do would be to join the professional organizations, the primary one being the American Psychology Law Society, APLS. It's the division of APA, that's forensic issues. That way you'll always kind of have a connection to the field. You'll be able to go to the conference and see what the field thinks is important. And then that organization publishes Law and Human Behavior, which is a really good journal to start tracking, just to kind of see who's writing what in forensic psychology. Law and Human Behavior is one, Criminal Justice, and CJB. Criminal Justice and Behavior is another one. There's probably other ones that I'm forgetting right now, but those are the ones that come to mind. Just kind of see what people are writing about nowadays. But anyways, so if you guys are interested in neuropsychology, and presumably you are, you kind of know what it is because you're here. If you're interested in neuropsychology, then you need to start neuropsychology a lot earlier and a lot more seriously, because neuropsychology is a relatively closed field. They are very specific about what the training requirements are. They're very specific about the sequence of things that you do, because neuropsychology is, there's a lot of reasons that this is the case, but neuropsychology is very organized. There's 3 to 4 professional organizations that all work together to define what neuropsychology is in the United States and internationally. They have training guidelines called the Houston Guidelines, where they have all met and decided and spelled out what neuropsych training looks like. And it includes classes, research and clinical training specifically on neuropsychology with neuropsychological populations. It includes an internship that's neuropsychological in nature. It includes a 2-year postdoc, which is neuropsychological in nature, and then a board certification process, which is all about neuropsychology. And because of that, if your end goal is board certification, which is where the field is moving, you have to start that in your graduate training. Basically where you all are right now. You are not late. If you're in this room right now, even you're not late. Graduate school is the entry point to the field. Whereas for forensic work, any point is the entry point to the field. So that was my understanding in grad school, working in both fields, and therefore for my internship and postdoc, I left forensic psychology behind, knowing I could always come back. And I pursued internship training and postdoc training in neuropsychology. And it's very clear which internships and postdocs are neuropsychological because the field is such that you have to make it very clear that everyone knows what they are, and they're all, it's very competitive to get into these. So for internship, I went from Drexel University for my doctoral training to New York University Medical Center, and they have Rusk Rehabilitation, which is a rehabilitation hospital, and I also worked for the Comprehensive Epilepsy Center, which is in their Department of Neurology. So basically working with people with brain injury and brain illness, assessing them, doing therapy with them, cognitive rehabilitation with them, individual sessions, group sessions, attending trainings and case conferences and grand rounds and all of those things. So that's what I did at NYU, and it's only a year, which is crazy because it's a lot of training in a year, and also postdoc happens right after, which means in the fall when I started my internship, I was already applying for postdoc. So no matter what you guys choose to do, whatever field you're going into, at the doctoral program, remember that the 4 to 5 years you're going to spend at the program is going to be your longest time to really focus on what you're doing. After that, it is a mad dash of applying to things constantly, having a lot of other kind of competing responsibilities. Graduate school, although it's very difficult, you'll look back on it fondly and think, I had so much time, I had so little responsibility, wasn't it great? I know it's hard to believe, especially with how much work you guys do here, that you will think this way, but I swear that you will. So I'm at NYU, I'm applying for a postdoc already, and I know I'm going to do neuropsych, so I'm only applying for neuropsych postdocs. I end up going to the University of Virginia Health System, which focused on neuropsychological assessment in really complicated psychiatric and forensic cases. It also happens that UVA supports one of the best postdocs in forensic psychology. I didn't end up at UVA by accident. It was my top choice. I knew if I went there that I would have faculty and mentors and opportunities to do forensic work. And by the way, NYU wasn't a mistake either. It was my top choice because one of the supervisors there is a big deal forensic neuropsychologist, and I wanted to work with him. So even though it's very neuro, you can see I'm doing as much forensic as possible. So that's where I was up until a few years ago. Last year I came here, so I was at UVA for a year, and then I had to apply for jobs and complete the second year of my postdoc. I always knew, because I had left the field of forensic psychology to do this whole neuropsych thing, I was always going to cut back and do a blended, find a job that I was able to blend all of my interests back together. I wasn't going to be very happy working as a neuropsychologist, doing neuropsychologist things in a neuropsychologist place. I think the methods are really cool. I love the patient population. The field is great, but it's just not my jam. It wouldn't keep me happy. I want it to be a place where I could explore and build out my forensic neuropsych interests. So John Jay being one of the best programs for forensic psychology in the country, and one where I came on a job talk and was talking about neuro all over the place, and everyone was like, yeah, cool, that's where we want to go. It seemed like a good home for me, and they agreed, so now I'm here. And that was like 20 years of education, and now I have my first job. It's crazy how that happens. So, now that I've been throwing these terms around a lot, I'm going to define them a little bit more, because it's going to matter for the next step. And so you all know forensic psychology. Psychology is the study of human behavior. Forensic psychology is the study of human behavior and relating that to the legal system. Hey. Same thing with how forensic neuropsychology is, the neuropsychology part is closed, the forensic part is open. Here, psychology is your main game. You guys are going to be psychologists. And if you want to be forensic psychologists or go to forensic programs, it means that you're going to be good psychologists who are asking questions that are relevant for the legal system or social justice, kind of broadly defined, right? So that's forensic psychology, is behavior and law. Neuropsychology, you are a psychologist first, and instead of the law, it's the brain. So it's brain-behavior relationships, it's using psychological techniques to study the brain, or working with people with brain injury and illness. It's psychology plus brain, right? Brain-behavior relationships is like the moniker of neuropsychology. If you look at the definitions for neuropsychology, it's always brain-behavior relationships, which they say as if that means something, as if that's less complicated than neuropsychology. But if you break it down, it's how are the brain and behavior related? We study behavior. A neuropsychologist asks the next question, what does that mean for the brain? Or the reverse, this person has these brain problems, how's that going to come out in their behavior? Right? That's all neuropsychology is. Forensic neuropsychology is brain behavior and law. You're a neuropsychologist who is answering questions or helping the legal system answer questions, doing things that matter for social justice. That's forensic neuropsychology. That's what you guys are here to learn about. Any questions about the conceptual idea behind forensic neuropsychology? Okay. So that's the field, or that's the practice. And now you also know kind of the practical components to it, that forensic neuropsychology is neuropsychology first, forensic is more open, all right? And that you have professional organizations in neuropsychology, just like you do for forensic psychology. The National Academy of Neuropsychology, the International Neuropsychological Society, the American Academy of Clinical Neuropsychology are the three big ones. They all have publications, they all have conferences, they all have student groups that have reduced fees. If you want to know more about neuropsychology, I recommend looking into these professional organizations. And maybe I can email you guys out a list of those, and we can distribute it out to the group. But basically, it's important to remember that all these things that you want to study, there's a field, there's a group of people who are deciding what that field looks like and the area of study looks like. And don't forget that. That's actually how you're going to learn a lot, is by finding who the people are, where they are, and going there and learning from them. Okay. So, what I'm doing now is taking everything that I learned studying forensic psychology, everything that I learned studying neuropsychology, mashing it together and pulling out questions that don't have answers, or that don't have satisfying answers quite yet. Where my primary area of interest right now is the problem of traumatic brain injury as it relates to criminal justice. So a traumatic brain injury is someone gets hit on the head and it causes problems. It's traumatic brain injury, right? And because there's so many risk factors for TBI that match up to the risk factors for criminal behavior, I would like us to see having a kind of TBI-informed way of talking to and working with people in the criminal justice system. If, again, knowing nothing else, around 6 out of 10 people are going to have a history of traumatic brain injury, you probably should understand more about how that's relating to their current functioning, how that makes them, what services they got, what services they couldn't access because they were in the criminal justice system, and all that. The reason being, traumatic brain injury, the main symptoms from it are poor attention, impulsivity, a harder time using your language to explain things. All of these sure seem like they would be problematic for you if you were trying to stay successful in the community, have relationships and jobs and housing, and not end up in the criminal justice system, right? I'm not talking about like extraordinary crime. I'm not talking about I bumped my head and now I'm a serial killer, which, by the way, serial killers have an insanely high rate of traumatic brain injury too, but I think that's more related to personality traits than the TBI causing it. I'm talking about normal, like everyday criminals who are from environments where crime was an outlet, crime was a community, crime was the only opportunity they saw that they had. Now they're involved in the criminal justice system and maybe they're resigned to it and they're learning how to be better criminals by their criminal friends in prison, or don't know that there are other opportunities, because those other opportunities are really hard if you have a hard time paying attention, you're kind of impulsive, you can't really make decisions very well. So I think that TBI is important for the criminal justice system to take a lot more seriously. The criminal justice system and all of psychology as well has really been taken with this trauma-informed care model, which I think is excellent. I think it was way overdue. I think that TBI is something similar. It could be something that's already living within this space that's undermining all of these things that we're doing to try and help this population, because we're not focusing on, at a very basic level, the people's attention, ability to inhibit themselves, solve problems, and at the same time we're expecting them to do all of these really difficult things that we all struggle with from time to time. And they don't have the resources to do it, and they may not have the cognitive resources as much as we do as well. So, I'll get off my soapbox now. You guys know why I think TBI is important. So in my lab right now, we are coming at this from a few different angles. So one study that I'm doing right now is from a public health perspective. I'm working with UVA, and I'm going to take everyone in that health record who was diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury in a specific time period. I'm going to get all of them. There's about like 1,000, like 1,500 of them. I'm going to get their names and social security numbers ethically. I'm going to go through the IRB, and there's a mechanism for doing it. So I'm going to get their names and social security numbers so that I can go to the Virginia judicial system, find what their criminal records look like before and after they were diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury, and start modeling who committed crime after a traumatic brain injury. Did they commit crime before too? Like, how much of an influence did the TBI seem to have on criminal behavior? And we're going to have a control group of people who experienced some other injury that put them in a hospital, but that isn't related to the brain. Typically, you look at arm fracture. For some reason, everyone chooses arm fracture because they're thinner bones, and if you break a bone elsewhere in your body, you may have sustained a big enough jolt that it also impacted your brain. So something like your femur or your leg bones, your arm bones are a little bit smaller, so everyone uses arm fractures. So we'll see, do the people with traumatic brain injury experience more crime after that injury compared to a control group? And if we follow literature from other countries doing this, like Sweden and Denmark, what they have shown is that experiencing a traumatic brain injury puts you at around a 2 to 2.5 more of a risk of being involved in the criminal justice system. The TBI itself, controlling for other things. That seems like it's important to know. That seems like it's important to know in the criminal justice system that we have, which is far more easy to fall into than in Sweden and Denmark. We'll see. By the way, we also know what the arrest rates are for everyone in Virginia, so we'll be able to use that as another comparison group. If the TBI group has more criminal justice involvement than everyone in Virginia, then that's another kind of data point showing that TBI seems to be something important to focus on. So that's one of the studies. That's kind of the most distant, like, we're collecting data, obviously, but it's not like directly with human beings. It's a lot of computer systems and databases and stuff like that. So a little bit more personal, a lot of my lab members right now are using my dissertation data. Remember, I did a 3-hour neuropsych evaluation with 100 people in a prison, and that's a lot of data points. I've published on it, I've presented on it, I presented it here, by the way, in my job talk, and it is pretty much what got me this job because it was such a beast of a project that I could talk about that and get a job like this. Again, I don't recommend doing it, but it did help me. So there's a lot of questions that are still waiting to be answered from this data set. What I published on was another thing that I think is really important, which is people involved in the criminal justice system are disproportionately Black, disproportionately Hispanic, disproportionately from Native populations, disproportionately from urban populations, and just every sort of marginalized, disenfranchised group that you can think of. We all know that. We're all at John Jay College. We're studying forensic psychology. The criminal justice system is broken, racist, call it what you will. I will call it racist and broken. So, if neuropsychology is going to be used to help make decisions about people involved in the criminal justice system, we have to make sure that our tools are valid in these marginalized groups. Most neuropsychological tools are validated, are normed on college-educated, white, Midwestern women, for the most part. Historically, they're getting much more diverse, but a lot of the more traditional kind of manual norms are very, very far away from the types of people in the criminal justice system. So what my dissertation was used to show was, look at the rates of impairment. Look at how poorly people scored. People, in fact, scored so poorly that if they were seen clinically, their impairments are so widespread, we'd probably say, well, this person is not going to be able to hold down a job, they're probably not going to have very successful relationships, they're going to have a hard time keeping stable housing, they're just very impaired. And they're clearly not. They hold jobs in the correctional facility, they maintain relationships in the correctional facility and outside. Obviously, them being the correctional facility to begin with shows that they're maybe not as successful at certain things than those in the normative group. But why are they scoring so low? The reason is the tools are racist, or the tools are classist, or the tools are not based on measuring these concepts in this type of population, which was predominantly male, predominantly African American, predominantly less than 12 years of education. And their maleness, Blackness, lack of education was being pathologized by these tools. Applying these tools to this group was picking up these differences, was not very sensitive to them, and was registering it as impairment, as impaired scores. That's problematic. If we're calling someone impaired and making clinical impressions and legal decisions based on their impairment, then we're doing them a disservice. We are working within the institutional racism and lack of sensitivity to marginalized groups. That is a problem. That's a problem because in 30 years, the minorities are going to become the majority. That means that all of these tests are not going to be valid, relevant for these groups in 30 years. The field of neuropsychology is taking this super seriously. They have an initiative called Relevance 2050. They are funneling tons of time and resources and money into research and clinical training to make the field of neuropsychology relevant in 2050. Not excellent, not the best, relevant. That's what they're fighting against. That's how seriously they're taking this. I think that the criminal justice system has something to teach everyone else. If we validate these tools on these wildly complicated individuals who are from all these marginalized groups, have high rates of depression and PTSD and ADHD and traumatic brain injury, then we're at least showing that they are true measures of these constructs, even when the people that they're being used with are messy, which is most of the people in the justice system, right? So I'm not just interested in the criminal justice system, I'm also interested in these marginalized groups, validating these tools with marginalized groups. And I have to be very clear and careful when I talk about this that I don't think that marginalized groups are inherently more criminal than non-marginalized groups, all right? I'm using the criminal justice system as a proxy, and I want to do work in validating these tools in more diverse groups than are currently being done. So, my dissertation was a first step. There's a lot of questions that are left unanswered, and my lab is exploring things like how does traumatic brain injury itself explain the relationship to criminal behavior, or is it things like impulsivity and attention? Do we need to be looking at all of these things, or should we just look at incidents of traumatic brain injury? Or should we just be measuring their impulsivity? Kind of where is the weight of that? Language development and verbal fluency have been shown to relate to recidivism, people committing crime. So why? What about it? Like, what do we need to focus on? And substance use. Is substance use by itself putting people at risk? Is there something about the effect of substances on how someone thinks? Their decision-making, verbal abilities, impulsivity, attention, is that kind of mediating or moderating the relationship? Like, what do we need to start paying attention to? So all that is going on too. I'm rather long-winded, so I know I'm probably running out of time. Okay. So, yeah, we're asking a lot of questions on a lot of different variables. I'm seeing my dissertation as like a recipe book for draw lines between variables, ask some questions, and test those models. See if see how it works out. Sort of. There's plenty more where that came from. So what we're also doing is the other problem I'm interested in is dementia. Dementia, major neurocognitive disorder, call it what you want. It's the thing when your brain ages and starts having problems, and those problems don't stop. They continually get worse. That's what dementia is. So with the aging population being what it is, we know that the baby boomers are aging into like high rates of dementia in a way that they're going to outstrip the system. There aren't people ready to take care of the baby boomers who are aging into Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia and those sorts of things. The same is true for the criminal justice system. Dementia causes problems with things like competency to stand trial, sanity, just involvement in criminal justice, wandering, impulsivity, things of that nature. It's going to be a very big problem. If you guys are like if you're betting people, I would put a lot of money on like dementia and crime being like a really big deal in the foreseeable future. So we did some preliminary looks in the lab, seeing like what's the information like about how people with dementia are treated in the justice system, and there's not that much out there. So one of my students is doing a thesis on case law review of dementia and competence to stand trial. Super basic. When questions of competence are raised, with people with dementia, what does that look like? What are the decisions? What types of issues are being brought up? We don't even have that basic information, which seems like it's important to know. Yeah?
You would expect that if they have to, excuse me, if they have dementia, that it's unlikely that they'll be restorable.
So then what do we do with them?
Precisely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like this is a large question the criminal justice system is not ready to answer, and it will be pressed upon them. There are great people in the criminal justice system and related systems working on this. It's not like no one's paying it. I'm not that unique. I'm not that visionary, but the attention is not being paid to it that it requires, and it's because people don't like working with the elderly. And people, it's a really hard population, and people aren't really thinking about it. It's ageist, and that's going to be a problem very, very quickly. So if you are interested in older adults, elderly populations, then I highly recommend that you start looking and seeing what opportunities there are for further training in that. Like just forensic psychology and elder is a good thing to be looking at. And then if you want a neuropsychological perspective, neuropsychologists are the ones that define and diagnose dementia. So it seems like a really good fit for a forensic neuropsychologist to be focused on. That project that I mentioned, by the way, is recruiting for someone to help with coding all of these cases. So if this is an area that you're interested in, Dana Miller, who's in my lab, will be sending out a call for volunteers who want more experience in that. So hopefully you'll come and work with us on that, but just keep an eye out for it. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is where I'm going. So for the next few years, I'm starting a new project that is focused on these very kind of practical issues in forensic neuropsychological assessment, traumatic brain injury, sorts of stuff. So it's kind of pulling on pieces that we've already talked about. The idea behind this study is that there's a few things that we need to either update or do for the first time. Things that we need to update. Let's say you guys had a traumatic brain injury. Let's say you guys were going to see a neuropsychologist because maybe you can't work anymore and you need some money. So it's a civil law sort of thing. And you know that between you and a bunch of money and not having to work for a little bit is a valuation. So workers' compensation evaluations for traumatic brain injury have been shown to have very high rates of malingering, response bias, exaggeration, and people prepare for these evaluations in ways that can undercut the validity of the evaluations themselves. So one of the aspects that we're going to be looking at is if someone has to pretend to have a TBI and they know they're coming in for an evaluation, what do they do to prepare? The last time this was studied was 20 years ago. The internet has changed quite a bit in the last 20 years. I'm sure there's a lot more information out there available for people preparing for these sorts of things. And this is the type of thing that just asking this question is really helpful. Yeah?
Why don't neuroimaging techniques rule out malingering in such cases? Like you can see if there's a neuroanatomical problem.
Oh, like you mean supporting the diagnosis of traumatic brain injury? Got it.
Like in a workman's comp situation.
So workers' compensation or anything with traumatic brain injury, we've talked about most of the examples that we came up with were severe traumatic brain injury where there's a bullet passing through the brain or a tamping rod passing through the brain or a large hit breaking the skull and indenting the brain. Those are the minority of traumatic brain injury cases. We can all agree that the person sustained a brain injury and is likely to have problems. At that point, it becomes less about, we become the ones that put numbers on how bad the problems are. It's not like if there's problems. The majority of cases are mild traumatic brain injury, which do not show up on MRIs or CTs or anything, even fMRIs where you're looking at the functioning. These are people who say, I hit my head, I'm still having problems. There's no physical evidence that they are. It's up to us and our tools to help the legal system see if that's the case. So we're really beyond the details of the injury itself. Our testing is like the only thing that we can really do. And that's why TBI is such a big part of forensic neuropsychology, because we're really the ones that are good at assessing them. So in these evaluations, knowing how people are preparing, how they've been coached, that sort of thing is just a really good practical issue, knowing what else is out there. Like if you Google TBI workers' comp neuropsych evaluation, are you going to find things that are going to help you try and trick our tests, right? So I'm recruiting 2 to 3 more people in my lab this semester, and that's what you can expect to work on. Either there's my dissertation data, which you can also kind of ask questions of, or there's this new study where we're actually going to be bringing people through the lab. Even if you're not interested in doing the thesis, you just want training on these measures, reach out, apply. You can affiliate with my lab. I can show you these measures and train you on them. You can do the evaluations, and then you can let other people worry about like the IRB paperwork and writing up the thesis and stuff. So basically, if you're interested in things, thinking about traumatic brain injury, thinking about like how do we know if the numbers we're getting are valid, what does this fancy new cognitive measure look like, let me know. You can find my information on the website. I have a quick application that you can fill out, and then I'll respond back to you, and I'll interview you, and we'll see if it's a fit. And part of that is like, at what level do you want to hang out and learn from me, right? It can be anything. I need a lot of hands on deck. So hopefully now you guys have a sense of kind of where I came from, what I did to get here, why I'm studying what I'm studying, and kind of how I'm doing it too. So hopefully I've succeeded in bringing you through all of those learning points and answering your questions along the way. I'm pretty sure I touched on the other questions that were asked, but in the few minutes that we have left, are there any like general questions or specific questions that I haven't covered yet? Okay. So the other thing I'll do is if the 2 people here who are in my lab want to raise their hands, if you have questions about what it's like to work with me or the types of projects that we're doing, you can reach out to them as well, go and find them, or you can reach out to me directly, all right? But I invite you guys to reach out, and we'll figure out kind of how you'll fit in. If nothing else, I'll give you some cool things to read, and you can come hang out with me later, okay? All right. Well, thank you all very much. Get some cookies and water before you leave.